Are you waiting for a housing crash or just a drop in prices? Well, you need to remember, opportunity doesn't always knock twice. So the real question is, should you buy now or should you wait? As the volatility in the market increases and interest rates bounce up and down, house prices are continuing to get more expensive. So what question should you be asking yourself if you're a potential buyer out there in today's market? Well, I want to be very, very blunt early on in this video. If you're asking someone like me whether or not you should buy a house, the answer is no. And the primary reason for that is you don't know me at all. In fact, buying a home is a personal decision and not something you should be asking someone else whether or not it makes sense. In fact, I want to add to that. If you're someone at the moment that doesn't have a stable job, you don't have money in the bank, you don't have good credit, you don't really have financial stability or even relationship stability, and you're asking the question of should you buy now or should you wait? The answer is a resounding no. At the end of the day, buying a home is a personal decision, and it should only be done when it's the right time in your life. Many of you know from watching my other videos that I made a personal decision about 2 months ago to give up my 2.99% interest rate on a 30-year fix and buy a home with a 7% interest rate on a 7-year adjustable rate. So the question is, why did I decide to buy then versus waiting for something to change in the future? Well, for me, it was the right time in my life. I'm currently married with 3 growing boys, ages 11, 9, and 5. And while we did own a home that could have worked for our family long term, at the end of the day, it just wasn't ideal. It was a 3-bedroom with 2.5 baths. All the boys were in a triple bunk in one room so that we could have another room for a play area, potential guests, and or somewhere just for the kids to hang out. And so for me, the decision really was about family. I wanted more space for my kids to be able to move around. I wanted a little bit more square footage. Ideally, I wanted a larger backyard so that the kids could go outside and play and not necessarily be stuck in the street and or in the house, especially when friends came over. Now, my wife and I had been eyeing a particular property for an extended period of time. Fortunately, I knew the seller on this property. He's actually a buddy of mine. He's a fellow real estate agent. And I've been reaching out to him a couple of times a year for the last 5+ years, asking him when he's going to sell me his house. Now, ideally, he would have said he wanted to sell it when interest rates were at 2.5–3%. But that's not reality. He actually called me back in October of 2023 when interest rates were hovering around 7%. So now the ball was in my court to make a decision of whether or not it makes sense. And I'll be completely honest, my wife and I went back and forth several times on the decision because we liked where we lived. We really liked the location. We liked our home. We had done all the upgrades ourselves, and we absolutely loved the neighbors. Now, keep in mind, we just moved about 200 yards down the street, so the neighbors are more or less still the same. They're not right beside us now, but they're just a short walk away. So while the location changed, it didn't really change a lot. But in some ways, this location was better because it backed to a large grassy area, which checked the box on giving the kids a large place to go out and play. On top of that, it was closer to the community pool, and we already had friends that lived just a couple of doors down. So while we moved away from some of our other friends, we moved closer to other friends. So we gained on that side. But the biggest concern was going to a more expensive house with property taxes that were going to more than triple from where we purchased our initial house, on top of our mortgage rate going from just under 3% to somewhere around 7%. So we did exactly what I tell you guys to do. Start thinking, where are you financially? Do you have money in the bank? Are you comfortable with the payment? Now, we didn't like the payment per se, but we were comfortable with it. We understood where it was. We understood the idea that mortgage rates are likely going to come down in the future, where we would be able to take advantage of a lower rate. In fact, for those of you who watch my videos a lot, I've actually already refinanced with no cost, dropped my rate to 6.5%. So I'm 0.5% lower than I was just 2 months ago with absolutely no cost out of pocket in that refinance because I took advantage of it when I did. Now, I could have waited and said, I'm not buying your home now. I'm going to wait and see what happens with mortgage rates. But the problem with that is mortgage rates could have continued to go higher. Now, while I thought they would have gone lower, I also thought that if we didn't buy this home, someone else was going to step up and take it from us. And as I told my wife several times in our discussions, if this isn't the right house, then what is the right house? This is the one we've been trying to buy for the better part of 5 years. Now we've been given the opportunity, so we either have to make the decision to do this and or stop looking entirely and just stay put with where we are. And because we knew we were going to be in this house long term, as the kids continued to get older, grow bigger, we weren't really concerned with what happens in the short term. And I think that's where a lot of people get it wrong. They think, hey, I'm going to go buy a house, and then they start watching the market every single day. Every fluctuation in the market, every headline that comes out, they pay attention to. They give it some sort of credit in their mind, and by doing that, it affects how they look at their own property. But the reality is, if the housing market were to crash, nothing actually happens to your home unless you absolutely needed to sell that property. Now, I'm a firm believer that the housing market isn't going to crash, so that's not really a concern. But if you're someone asking yourself these questions, let's say you are a home buyer that does have good credit, that does have income in the bank, you have that financial stability, you have relationship stability, you have job security, you have that longer term time horizon in the property that you're going to buy. If then you're asking the question of should you buy or should you wait, I think the easy answer is yes. But at the end of the day, you have to be the one to make that decision. I'll be the first to tell you, as a real estate agent, it's not always a great time to buy a home because there are fluctuations in the market. But there are a couple of things you need to keep in mind, especially when you look at real estate from a longer term horizon. Home prices have appreciated on average about 4.6% over the last 65 years here in the United States. And if you're lucky enough to live in Orange County, California, where I live, home prices have appreciated about 8.5% over the last 10 years. So every single year you've decided to delay your purchase, you're essentially missing out on somewhere between 8 and 9% appreciation in that property. And during that period of time, rents have continued to increase. So one thing you need to consider as a buyer is the earlier that you purchase a home, the earlier you can fix your housing costs. And the earlier you can do that in your life, the better off you're going to be long term. And that's because over time, you're going to be able to avoid things like rent increases. All the while, you should be making more money. Your wages should be increasing annually, which means that housing cost that you fix becomes a smaller piece of your overall budget. In addition to that, as interest rates move down, which they're likely to in the future, you can take advantage of lower interest rates, and you might even be able to lower that housing cost even more, making it even less of your overall budget. But if you decide to wait and delay for the perfect opportunity to buy a house, chances are you're never going to end up buying a house because there is no perfect scenario. There's rarely a time in life when home prices are coming down, interest rates are coming down at the same time, and you feel secure enough to pull the trigger. In fact, what happens most of the time as house prices start to pull back, people believe that home prices are going to continue to pull back. Therefore, they wait because they don't really want to catch that falling knife, if you will. But then what happens, just like the stock market happens, is things turn and they start to bounce up, and people believe, well, they're going to turn back down. This can't be the bottom, but oftentimes it is the bottom. And then home prices appreciate from there. And they think, well, I'm just going to wait till they come back down again. And then they end up waiting for years, sometimes decades, as home prices continue to appreciate. And that's exactly what I've seen as a real estate agent time and time again. I've had clients sell their homes, sit on the sidelines, and want to wait for the housing market to correct. Guess what? Those clients are still renters today. They never bought a home because they were waiting on the perfect scenario. In fact, they got priced out of the market entirely and are no longer in a position to buy here in Orange County because of where prices went. Now, as I said earlier, it's not always a great time to buy. There's a lot of things happening in the macro economy right now, with inflation, with interest rates, with turmoil happening overseas between different countries. There's always something going on, which could be a reason for you to tell yourself it's not a good time to buy. And it very well could not be a good time to buy because it's not the right time in your life. On top of the things I mentioned earlier about fixing your housing costs, the other thing that happens as you buy a home is you continue to build equity as that home appreciates, on top of you paying down principal during that same period of time. So not only are you fixing your housing costs earlier in your life, which over time will become a smaller piece of the puzzle, as we mentioned earlier, you're also gaining that appreciation that we talked about. On average, 4.6% per year for the last 65 years. Now, it's not always going to be 4.6%. Some years it's going to be 7, 8%. Some years it might be flat. It might even be down a little bit, but the average is 4.6%. That's why it's important that we focus on that longer term time horizon that I mentioned earlier. That's probably the most important piece of thinking whether or not you should buy now. out. But in addition to that, the whole time, if you're making your mortgage payments, regardless of what happens in the market, if there is a crash, you continue to make payments on that property, you're in turn putting money into a forced savings account, which again, you're not able to really access that money unless you sell your home or refinance and pull cash out. But the reality is you're paying down that principal every single month versus renting. You're not paying down the principal. In fact, you're not paying anything to benefit yourself other than having a roof over your head. You're in turn paying someone else's mortgage and helping them add to their long-term generational wealth. So while buying a home is a personal decision, there are some times when you should not buy a home. And that's if you have that shorter term time horizon that I was talking about earlier. If you're thinking of only being in a home for 2-3 years, I wouldn't personally buy a home in this market. In fact, I wouldn't buy a home in this market unless I could keep it as a rental long term. That would be a reason that maybe you buy, even if you only plan to live there a shorter period of time. But also, if I couldn't buy a home that works for my family for the next, say, 5, 7, 10 years, if I know I'm going to have multiple kids, I'm getting ready to get married, and the only thing I can afford is a studio, then I'm probably not going to be a buyer, at least in the market that I live in, if I can't afford it there. Now, I might consider buying a home out of state and or moving to a more affordable area. That's always an option. People often get caught up in the idea that I can't afford anything. I can't buy anything here. Therefore, I'm just going to rent for life. Well, remember, there are more affordable areas of the country that you can move to. And I firmly believe that homeownership is that important that sometimes it does make sense to move. But maybe you don't want to move. Maybe you want to live where you want to live. You can still buy a property out of state, maybe an investment property, and still take advantage of being a homeowner. In fact, you can be one of those people where somebody else pays your mortgage if you do it right. But on top of having the longer term time horizon, you need to have some money in the bank. Like I said, you need to have financial stability, you need to have job security, you need relationship stability, and you really need to have good credit. Your credit affects your monthly payment, your interest rate more than anything else. So if I was a buyer and I had all of those other things and I had crappy credit, I would spend the time working on my credit, trying to improve it before actually pulling the trigger. Because everything you do around buying a house is based on your credit score. And it could very well be worth your time to work on that credit score because it could end up affecting your bottom line. You could end up purchasing more home by having better credit because you end up with a lower rate and in turn a lower monthly payment. So depending on what you're trying to accomplish, you need to have those things intact. But as I mentioned earlier, buying a home is a personal decision that only you should be answering. So don't reach out to anyone else asking that question. But if you've decided it's the right time in your life, you're ready to buy, what else do you need to think about? Well, do me a favor and check out this video here.